Why chasing happiness is making you miserable. Carl Jung observed that a person can have every comfort in place, the career, the marriage, the calendar full of pleasant things, and still come apart from the inside, because comfort was never the thing the psyche was asking for. As Jung wrote in Psychology and Alchemy, people will do anything, no matter how absurd, in order to avoid facing their own souls, and happiness, chased hard enough, chased as a project, as a mood to be manufactured and defended, becomes exactly that kind of absurdity, a bright errand you run, so you never have to sit still with what your own life is actually asking of you. And that is where we begin tonight, not with a trick for feeling better, but with the strange and almost embarrassing discovery that the harder you run at happiness, the more it behaves like a shadow on the wall, always the same distance ahead, never closer, no matter how fast your legs move. The first key is that happiness was never the promise. Jung made no promise of happiness. Not once in his whole body of work did he suggest that the aim of a life is to feel good as often as possible. What he found instead, sitting with patient after patient in Zurich, was that the ones who suffered most were not the ones with the hardest circumstances, they were the ones whose lives had stopped meaning anything. He called this condition, plainly, the senselessness and aimlessness of their lives, and he meant it as a diagnosis, not a mood. Imagine a woman, and this is a composite, who keeps a small list on her phone titled Things That Will Finally Make Me Happy, a new apartment, a certain number on the scale, a partner who checks every box. She reaches one item after another over the years, the apartment, the number, even something close to the partner, and each time there is a lift, real and warm for a few days, and each time the lift drains away faster than the last one did, until she is standing in the very apartment she once circled in red, wondering why the walls feel just as thin as the old ones did. This is not bad luck, and it is not a flaw in her particular list. It is what happens whenever happiness itself is made the destination, rather than a visitor that shows up along the way. Think about your own Tuesday, the one where nothing went wrong exactly. The coffee was fine. The meetings were fine. You scrolled the phone for a hit of something, a laugh, a like, a small charge of good feeling, and by evening, you felt more hollow than when you started. That hollowness is not a failure to relax properly. It is not a shortage of pleasure. It is the sound of a life running without a why. So let us say it plainly. It is not happiness you are missing. It is meaning. And no amount of pleasant sensation, stacked on top of an aimless life, will ever add up to a life that feels like it is yours. So here is my first quiet resolution, and I will say it once and then again. I will stop measuring my days by how they felt, and start asking what they were for. I will stop measuring my days by how they felt, and start asking what they were for. The second key is what Jung came to call, without much drama, the general neurosis of our age. He was not talking about the poor or the desperate. He was talking about his patients who had already arrived, the ones who had built the career, filled the house, taken the vacations, and who sat across from him describing a flatness they could not name. Imagine a man, and this is a composite, the kind of person any of us might recognize, who gets the promotion he had been working toward for a decade, and for about 3 weeks he feels the lift he expected, and then the flatness returns, heavier this time, because now even the promotion has been spent. And there is nothing left to blame the emptiness on. He cannot say his life is bad. By every visible measure it is good. And that is precisely what makes it so disorienting. Because he had been taught, the way most of us were taught, that the emptiness would lift once the achievement arrived. And it did not lift. It just changed its clothes. Now imagine a second composite alongside him. A woman who redecorates her house every couple of years. New furniture, a fresh color on the walls, a small renovation, and each time the work finishes, she feels a genuine lightness for a week or two. The rooms look like a different life, and then, quietly, the old flatness seeps back in through the new paint, and she finds herself standing in a beautiful kitchen she cannot explain not loving. This is the same mechanism wearing a different coat. The mind keeps assuming that the next external change will be the one that finally holds. And it never quite does, because nothing external was ever built to hold that particular ache. Jung sat with hundreds of people in exactly this condition, and he did not treat it as a chemical problem or a scheduling problem. He treated it as a spiritual fact of the modern condition. A life can be technically successful and existentially bankrupt at the same time, and no vacation fixes that. No renovation fixes that. Because you cannot wrest your way out of a question your life has stopped answering, and you cannot redecorate your way past it either. Notice this in yourself this week. Notice the moment after the good thing happens. The raise, the compliment, the trip you had been saving for, the new couch, the finished project. Notice how quickly the mind reaches for the next thing to chase. That reaching, that quickness, is not ambition. Half the time it is dread. Dread of sitting in the silence after the prize has been collected and finding the silence still empty. And here is the part worth sitting with a moment longer. The flatness is not punishing you for succeeding. It is trying to tell you that success was answering a question your psyche never actually asked. So here is my resolution for this key. I will stop treating achievement as a cure for emptiness. I will stop treating achievement as a cure for emptiness. The third key is the one that reorganizes everything else. And it is this: neurosis, Jung wrote, is always a substitute for legitimate suffering. Sit with that phrase, legitimate suffering. Jung was not a man who glorified pain. He was not telling his patients to suffer nobly and say nothing. What he meant was more precise and, I think, more useful. There is a suffering that belongs to being alive, the grief of loss, the ache of growing older, the discomfort of outgrowing a version of yourself, the quiet difficulty of a decision that has no clean answer. This suffering, when it is faced, moves you somewhere. It is fertile. It changes the shape of the person having it. But when this suffering is refused, when it is dodged and buried and paved over with distraction, it does not disappear. It converts. It becomes something else. A free-floating anxiety with no object. An irritability that attaches itself to your spouse or your co-workers for no good reason. A numbness that makes even good news feel far away. This is sterile suffering. It goes in circles. It produces nothing. Imagine a woman, and this is a composite, no different from a dozen people any of us could name, who lost her father 3 years ago, and who told herself, sensibly enough at the time, that she did not have the luxury of grieving properly because the funeral needed planning, and the family needed steadying, and the job did not pause for anyone's loss. So she did what looked like the strong thing. She kept moving. She filled the evenings that used to ache with errands and small tasks, and a great deal of pleasant noise. And 3 years later, she cannot explain why an ordinary Sunday afternoon leaves her irritable at her own children over nothing at all. Why a minor disappointment at work sends her into a flatness that lasts for days. The grief did not go anywhere. It simply changed its address. It moved out of its rightful place, which was hers to feel honestly, and into 100 smaller rooms of her life where it does not belong. This is what Jung meant by sterile suffering. Suffering that has been denied its true object, and so attaches itself, blindly, to whatever is nearest. And here is the part that concerns tonight's title directly. The chase for happiness is very often exactly this kind of substitute. It is a way of running from the legitimate ache your life is presenting you, by manufacturing a constant low-grade campaign of good feelings. In 1959, Jung sat for a filmed BBC interview and said, in his careful, unhurried way, that man cannot stand a meaningless life, and he meant that the psyche will produce symptoms, will produce restlessness, will produce this exact hunger for happiness we are discussing, precisely in the place where meaning is missing. Notice how this works in smaller ways too. The argument you keep smoothing over instead of finally having. The tiredness you keep calling laziness instead of asking what it is protecting you from. The vague dread on Sunday evening that you medicate with one more show instead of asking what Monday is actually dreading. None of these are happiness problems. They are unfinished griefs and unmade decisions wearing the costume of a bad mood. So ask yourself honestly this week, when you feel that pull toward another purchase, another scroll, another plan to feel better fast, what question are you avoiding by reaching for it? What grief have you not let yourself finish? What decision have you been postponing under the cover of staying busy and staying pleasant? Because the aim was never to avoid all discomfort. The aim was to suffer the right things, the ones that belong to you, instead of manufacturing 100 small, unnecessary ones to keep from noticing the real one. So my resolution here, I will let the suffering that is mine to have, and stop generating the kind that is not. I will let the suffering that is mine to have, and stop generating the kind that is not. The fourth key is a phrase Jung used in Modern Man in Search of a Soul, and it has stayed with me for years. The least of things with a meaning, he wrote, is worth more than the greatest of things without it. Read that again slowly. The least of things, not the grandest achievement, not the biggest win, the least thing. A phone call to a friend who is struggling. 10 minutes spent actually present with your child, instead of half present with your phone. A walk taken slowly, instead of as exercise to be logged. An ordinary Tuesday task, done with attention, instead of resentment. Done this way, it outweighs, in the currency that actually matters to a human psyche. The greatest of things done without meaning. The expensive trip taken to prove something. The achievement collected mostly for the audience it will impress. And this is worth sitting with, because it runs against nearly everything modern life has trained into you. You have been taught, quietly and constantly, that value scales upward, that more square footage, more followers, more zeros on the number, more people impressed at the dinner table, must automatically translate into more of whatever it is you are actually hungry for. And Jung, listening to patient after patient in his consulting room, found the opposite to be true so often that he stopped being surprised by it. Think for a moment about how strange this actually is. We live in an age that has built entire machines for measuring scale, the follower count, the square footage, the salary figure, the number of guests at the party, all of it countable, all of it comparable, all of it able to be placed on a chart and shown to someone else as proof. But meaning has no such chart. Meaning does not show up on a follower count. It does not photograph well. It cannot be placed side by side with someone else's version and declared the winner, and because of this, a mind trained by scale quietly starts to suspect that anything uncountable must also be unimportant. This is the trap hiding underneath the whole happiness chase. You go looking for what can be measured because measurement feels like proof, and meaning, stubborn and quiet, refuses to be measured at all, so it gets crowded out. Not because it is weak, but because it does not compete on the same terms as everything else shouting for your attention. Imagine, for a moment, a woman, and this is a composite, the kind of person any of us might recognize from our own lives, who spends an entire Saturday exactly as she planned. An expensive brunch with acquaintances she is not especially close to. A shopping trip that produces a bag of things she forgot she wanted by Monday. A photograph taken at a nice angle in nice light. And by the time she is home that evening, lying on the couch scrolling through the photograph and its small collection of approving comments, she feels strangely worse than when the day began. Not devastated, nothing so dramatic, just a fine grey film over everything. A sense that she performed a day rather than lived one. And now imagine that same woman, on some other ordinary Wednesday with nothing planned at all, spends 40 minutes on the phone with her sister, who is going through a hard divorce, saying very little useful, mostly just staying on the line, mostly just refusing to hang up too soon, and afterward she notices, almost with surprise, that she feels something like peace. Nothing photographed that call. Nothing about it will ever appear anywhere. It cost her nothing but attention, and yet it sits in her the way the Saturday never did. Now picture a second composite alongside her, a man who spends years building toward a single visible marker of arrival, the corner office, the title on the door, the moment his name is finally read aloud at the company dinner, and the night it happens. The applause is real, the handshake from the founder is real, the photograph taken on someone's phone is real, and he drives home that night turning the radio up rather than down, filling the car with noise, and he could not fully say why, until much later, sitting with the memory, he realizes the evening that actually meant something that same month was not the dinner at all. It was a Tuesday 2 weeks earlier, when his teenage daughter, unprompted, sat on the end of his bed and talked for 20 minutes about a boy she liked and a friend who had hurt her feelings. And he had said almost nothing. He had simply listened, and she had said, before leaving the room, "Thanks for actually hearing that." That sentence, spoken once, in a doorway, on a night that produced no photograph and no applause, outlasted the corner office in every way that mattered to him. This is not sentimental. This is exactly the mechanism Jung was describing. The least of things, unglamorous, unphotographed, often invisible to everyone but you, carries a weight that the greatest of things, dressed up and displayed, quietly lacks. And here is where we turn this toward you directly. Because up to now, we have been talking about composites and a general observation. But this is where it becomes personal. Think back over your last month, and be honest with yourself, the way you would be honest with no one else. How many of your hours were spent chasing the greatest of things without meaning? And how many were spent inside the least of things with meaning? Most people, when they actually sit down and do this kind of accounting, are quietly shocked at the ratio, not because their lives are bad, but because so much of the effort, so much of the actual planning and spending and posturing went toward things that turned out to weigh almost nothing once they were over, while the moments that actually left a residue, that actually stayed with them, cost almost nothing and were barely noticed while they were happening. Notice too how this plays out in language itself. How often you describe a day as good because something big happened, a trip, a purchase, a piece of recognition, and how rarely you describe a day as good because of something small, the 10 minutes of real attention, the honest words spoken plainly. And yet if you are truthful with yourself, it is almost always the small, unremarked thing that you find yourself returning to in memory years later. Nobody, on their last evening, reaches back across a whole life and asks to relive the square footage. They reach for the ordinary Tuesday that somehow held more than it should have. This alone tells you something about which ledger the psyche has actually been keeping all along, even while your conscious mind was busy keeping the other one. We have been trained, by advertising, by comparison, by the entire visible machinery of modern life, to believe that scale is what matters. Bigger house, bigger title, bigger circle of acquaintance, bigger highlight reel for other people to scroll past. But Jung's patients, the successful and quietly empty ones who filled his appointment book in Zurich, were living proof against exactly this belief. They had scale. Many of them had scale in abundance, and scale had failed them completely. It had bought them comfort, and had not bought them a single ounce of meaning. And meaning, it turns out, was the only thing the psyche was actually asking for all along. So consider this an invitation rather than an instruction. Notice this week the moments that seem too small to count, the short, unremarkable exchange, the quiet task done with real attention, the ordinary kindness that will never be mentioned again by anyone. And notice how differently these sit in you compared to the bigger, louder things you have been taught to chase. This noticing alone begins to retrain something. It begins to teach the eye where the actual gold has been lying the whole time, unclaimed, because it never announced itself loudly enough to be seen. So my resolution for this key: I will count meaning, not scale. When I take stock of my day, I will count meaning, not scale. When I take stock of my day. The fifth key goes deeper into why the happiness chase specifically backfires, and not just fails to help, but actively works against you while it looks. From the outside, like ambition or self-improvement, when you make happiness itself the target, you are, without quite realizing it, asking your life to stop presenting you with anything difficult. You are asking for a permanent plateau of good feeling, and Jung would say this request runs directly against the grain of what a psyche actually is. A psyche is not a still pond to be kept calm. It is closer to a river with a direction. It wants to move somewhere. It wants to become something it is not yet. This is the work he called individuation, the slow coming into your own particular selfhood, and that work cannot happen without friction, without the ache of outgrowing an old idea of yourself, without the discomfort of a decision that costs you something. So when you spend your energy defending a mood instead of following that current, you are, in effect, damming the river to keep the water still, and stagnant water, whatever its temperature, does not stay pleasant for long. It grows something unpleasant in the stillness. Imagine a woman, and this is a composite, the kind of person any of us might recognize, who keeps a small ritual most evenings, a glass of wine, a favorite show, the phone open on one knee scrolling for something warm and easy. She calls this her wind down. She calls it self-care. And for years, it has done exactly what she asked of it. It has kept the evening pleasant. But there is a particular knock at her door most nights around 9. Not literal, a thought that rises just as the show reaches a lull, a thought about her sister she has not spoken honestly with in 3 years, a thought about the job that stopped meaning anything the day her mentor retired, a thought about her own face in the mirror, looking older than she expected, and asking, quietly, what all this pleasantness has actually been for, and what she does, every night without deciding to, is reach for the remote, refill the glass, open the phone a little wider, and the thought goes back under. This is not weakness. This is not a character flaw. This is the exact mechanism we are describing tonight. Small, reasonable-looking, entirely understandable, and cumulative, because each single evening of this costs her almost nothing. But stacked across months and years, it becomes a life quietly organized around never letting the true question finish its sentence. Now here is the part that matters most, and it is not a story about her, it is a mirror held up to you. Think of the last time you cut a hard conversation short because it threatened your mood for the evening. Think of the last time you chose the easier, pleasanter option over the truer, harder one. Not because the harder one was wrong, but because you had quietly decided that protecting your good feeling that day mattered more than following what your own life seemed to be asking of you. Maybe it was a message you left unanswered, because answering honestly would have required admitting you were wrong. Maybe it was a plan for your work you have sketched a dozen times and never started, because starting would mean risking failure in front of people who currently believe you already have it figured out. Maybe it was simply a Sunday afternoon where a certain sadness rose up in you for no clear reason, and you filled it immediately with errands and noise rather than letting it say what it came to say. This happens to nearly everyone. The question worth asking is not whether you do this, you do. The question is whether you can start to notice it while it is happening, rather than only in hindsight, because noticing is the entire hinge on which this key turns. Jung was careful never to romanticize suffering for its own sake. He did not sit with his patients in Zurich and instruct them to manufacture hardship as a kind of discipline. That would have been its own form of absurdity. What he asked was quieter and, in a way, harder, that a person stop flinching away from the hardship that is already, honestly, theirs, the grief that has not been let land, the conversation that keeps being postponed, the direction a life has been quietly pointing toward for longer than a person wants to admit. Notice the difference. This is not an instruction to seek out pain. It is an instruction to stop paying the enormous ongoing cost of avoiding the pain that already belongs to you. And that cost is rarely obvious in any single moment. It shows up instead as the flatness we spoke of earlier, as the low-grade dread that arrives right after a pleasant evening ends, as the strange fatigue of a person who has technically rested all weekend and still feels as though nothing was replenished, because nothing was. The river was only dammed a little longer, and a dammed river does not rest, it merely stops moving, and a psyche that has stopped moving toward its own becoming will always, eventually announce this to you, in symptoms if not in words, in restlessness if not in speech. So try, this week, a small act of noticing, rather than any grand reversal, when you feel that familiar reach toward the next pleasant distraction, the show, the scroll, the errand invented mostly to stay busy. Pause for just a breath before you take it, and ask simply, what am I about to avoid feeling? You do not have to answer fully. You do not have to solve it on the spot. Jung's whole method rested on the idea that consciousness itself, the mere act of seeing a thing clearly, begins to change its hold over you. So the pause is the practice. The noticing is the practice, not some sudden leap into confronting every buried grief and postponed decision in one evening. That would be its own kind of violence against yourself. What is asked instead is smaller and steadier. A willingness to let the river move an inch further each time, instead of packing the dam a little higher. So my resolution here, I will stop damming the river to protect my mood for one more evening. I will stop damming the river to protect my mood for one more evening. The sixth key is the practice itself, put simply and without any complication, because Jung was suspicious of complicated cures, and this one is not complicated. It asks only for honesty repeated over time. Take the least of things audit from earlier and extend it. At the close of each day, ask 2 questions, not one. First, what felt meaningful today, however small? And second, what did I avoid feeling today because it would have cost me my good mood? Write both down, in the same notebook if you keep one, and do this for at least 2 weeks, because a single day tells you almost nothing. A pattern over 2 weeks starts to tell you the truth. Let me make this concrete, because an idea like this can float away unless it lands somewhere ordinary. Imagine a woman, and this is a composite, the kind of person any of us could be on a given week. She keeps the audit for the first time on a Sunday night, and the page is almost embarrassing in how thin it is. Under meaningful she writes, called my sister back, and under avoided she writes, nothing I think, because she cannot yet see what she is avoiding. She has not built the muscle for it. By Wednesday, the page has more on it. Under meaningful, sat with my son, while he talked about a friend problem, instead of finishing the dishes first. Under avoided, I knew I needed to tell my manager. The deadline is not realistic, and I said nothing again. By the second Sunday, a shape has emerged that she did not expect. The meaningful column keeps naming small, unplanned moments, none of them the reward she thought she was working toward, and the avoided column keeps circling the same 2 or 3 things. The honest conversation at work, an old argument with her mother that never actually resolved, a decision about whether to keep pursuing a promotion she is not sure she even wants. This is not a dramatic revelation. Nothing collapses, no lightning strikes, but she now has, in her own handwriting, a map of exactly where her legitimate suffering has been waiting, patiently, while she spent her evenings trying to feel better instead of trying to understand what she felt. Notice something else about her page, because it teaches the practice from a second angle. The avoided column does not shrink with time, and this can feel, at first, like failure, as though the exercise is not working. But Jung would say the opposite is true. The same theme returning again and again is not the practice failing, it is the practice finally working. It is the true shape of her unfinished business surfacing, where before it had no name at all. A thing that keeps knocking is not a thing that has gotten worse. It is a thing that has finally been noticed enough to keep knocking audibly, instead of being drowned out by the evening's noise. This is worth saying plainly, because most people, seeing the same avoided item appear night after night, conclude they are stuck, when in fact they have only just arrived at the starting point Jung was always pointing toward, the place where a person stops mistaking the symptom for the disease and finally sees the actual question underneath it. Think now of a second composite, a man this time, who keeps the same audit for reasons of his own, and whose avoided column, week after week, holds one line only, a version of, I still have not told my father I forgave him, or I still have not told my father I have not forgiven him. He is not certain which. The details shift slightly from night to night, but the shape does not move. And here is what he notices. After a month of this, the nights he writes something honest in that column, even without acting on it, even without picking up the phone, are nights he sleeps more easily than the nights he writes nothing there at all. This is a small and almost unremarkable fact, but it carries the whole weight of the key, naming the avoided thing, even before you are ready to face it fully, even before you know what to do about it, already begins to loosen its grip, because what Jung understood, sitting across from patient after patient in that quiet room in Zurich, Was that consciousness itself? The mere act of seeing a thing and writing it down honestly changes the thing's hold over you. Not instantly, not dramatically, but the way a stone in a shoe feels different once you have stopped pretending it isn't there. This is what the practice is for. Not to make you feel worse, and not to manufacture hardship where none exists. Jung was firm about this. He did not romanticize pain. He did not ask his patients to go looking for suffering as a kind of discipline or a badge. What he asked was quieter and, in its way, kinder. That a person stop running quite so fast from the hardship that is already knocking at the door, because the door is already knocking, for all of us, in some form. And the running is what turns ordinary difficulty into the general neurosis we discussed earlier, the flatness, the restlessness, the hunger for one more pleasant distraction. So notice how different this is from the chase we began the night with. The chase says, find the feeling, protect the feeling, defend the feeling against anything that threatens it. The practice says something almost the opposite. Notice what you have been protecting your feeling from, and let it in a little, on your own terms, at your own pace, not as a flood, just as an honest entry in a notebook at the end of an ordinary day. You will find, if you keep this for long enough, that the same 2 or 3 themes keep returning in your avoided column. This is not a coincidence, and it is not bad luck. Jung would say this is simply where your individuation is asking to happen. The particular unfinished business your particular life has been carrying. For one person, it is a relationship that needs one honest sentence spoken plainly, instead of managed carefully for years. For another, it is a grief from a decade back that never got its proper hearing, because there was always something more urgent to attend to. For another, it is a direction for their work that they have privately known for a long time and have been postponing under the cover of being busy and being fine. None of these require you to blow up your life. None of them require grand gestures. What they require is smaller and, in some ways, harder. That you stop treating the discomfort as the enemy and the pleasant feeling as the goal. That you let the least thing, the honest sentence, the returned phone call, the quiet decision finally made, take its rightful place ahead of the greatest thing done only to keep the mood intact. And if you find, doing this, that the avoided column touches something old and heavy, a grief that has never really been let land, a wound that seems larger than an evening's honesty can hold, know that naming it in a notebook is not the same as resolving it alone in silence. Sometimes the honest entry is itself the whole step for that day, and sometimes it is the first sentence in a longer conversation you will need to have with someone you trust, a friend, a partner, someone qualified to sit with what is heavy. The practice is not a substitute for that kind of help. It is only the small, honest beginning that tells you where such help might actually be needed. And here is the mercy in it, because this key should not close on effort alone. When you keep this practice, something in you does begin to quiet, not because you have found some permanent plateau of contentment. Jung never promised that, and I will not pretend to either, but because you have stopped asking your days to perform a feeling for you on command, and started asking them instead to mean something, and a day that means something, even a hard day, even a day with real difficulty or real grief inside it, sits differently in the body than a day spent manufacturing cheer. It sits like it belongs to you. It does not need to be defended or maintained or protected from the next inconvenient thought. It simply sits there, solid, the way a thing sits when it is actually yours. So here is the last resolution of the night, and I will say it once and then again. I will ask what my day means, before I ask how my day feels. I will ask what my day means before I ask how my day feels. Here is the whole picture. Happiness was never the promise. Meaning was. An empty life stays empty no matter how full the calendar gets. Neurosis is what unfaced suffering turns into when it is denied its proper shape. The least thing done with meaning outweighs the greatest thing done without it. The chase for constant good feeling dams the very current that was meant to carry you somewhere. And the way through is not more pleasure, chosen more carefully, but honesty about what you have been avoiding, asked quietly, at the end of each ordinary day. If any of this landed somewhere true tonight, You do not need to explain it to anyone. Just leave the two words "face it." Nothing more. A small marker for yourself that you heard it. And so we come back to where we started. Chasing happiness makes you miserable, not because happiness is wrong to want, but because it was never built to be chased, only to arrive, quietly, uninvited, as the byproduct of a life finally willing to mean something,